They sold her for being too big. The cowboy picked her up and said, "You're just right for my arms, Western Frontier." 1887, dust-choked streets of Dry Creek, Montana. Whispers skittered through the dry air like tumbleweeds. "She's too big. They can't keep her." The words bit at Evelyn's ears as she stood in the dim glow of the sheriff's lantern, her suitcase clutched tightly. Her heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the bitter sting of rejection. She had worked hard all her life, yet tonight she was being sold like livestock, judged by the cruel measure of another's shallow world. The saloon door creaked, spilling light onto the rough boardwalk. A low murmur ran through the patrons, curious eyes tracking Evelyn's every move. Then came the sudden hush. A tall figure leaned against the hitching post. A broad-shouldered cowboy with storm-dark eyes and a quiet authority that made the world seem smaller. Dust swirled at his boots, lantern light glinting off the edges of his weathered hat. He tipped it slightly, and with a voice deep and steady as the Montana River, he said, "You're just right for my arms." In that instant, the gossiping tongues faltered. A spark of something unfamiliar, hope, safety, perhaps love, stirred in Evelyn's chest. Could one man's belief in her worth undo years of shame and abandonment? The night held its breath, and the frontier seemed suddenly vast yet intimate. Ready to rewrite her story, the sun bore down mercilessly on the dry, cracked boardwalks of Dry Creek, Montana. As the townsfolk gathered in a loose semicircle, boots scuffing against the dust, whispers like sharp blades cutting through the afternoon heat. Evelyn's stomach knotted with each passing moment. The coarse rope of her hair tugged against her neck as if the very earth sought to hold her in place. She gripped the edges of her worn suitcase until her knuckles turned white, eyes darting from face to face, each judging her with an unspoken cruelty. A woman behind her whispered, "They say she's too big, too much for any man to want," and the words sank into her like stones. The auctioneer's gavel struck the wooden podium with a hollow thud that echoed through the square, announcing the start of her public humiliation. Evelyn's heart thumped, a rapid drum of fear and disbelief. As he described her qualities like livestock, her height, her strength, her supposed excess, she pressed her lips together, feeling the sting of tears that would betray her shame if they fell. Her mind raced, fleeting images of freedom shimmering in her imagination, horseback rides under open skies, nights wrapped in soft blankets, hands not pushing her away. But reality anchored her feet to the unforgiving boards beneath. She dared not hope for salvation. Trust had long been a stranger. From the periphery, Jacob watched, his broad frame leaning against a hitching post, a shadow in the heat-hazed sunlight. Dust clung to his boots, hat brim shadowing storm-dark eyes that followed every tremor of Evelyn's body, every flinch at the sharp eyes of the auctioneer. He noted the tilt of her shoulders, the stubborn set of her jaw, the trembling fingers that refused to let go. He saw her as no one else did, strong, unbroken, worthy. When the auctioneer raised his voice, demanding higher bids, Jacob's hand brushed the grip of his revolver, not in threat, but in quiet promise. He murmured under his breath, low and steady as the Montana wind, "You're just right for my arms." The words traveled only to her ears, carrying warmth where none had existed, a soft disruption against the cruel chorus of the town. Evelyn's eyes flickered toward him, suspicion mingling with the faintest spark of hope. For the first time that afternoon, she felt a pulse of possibility, an inkling that not all the world sought to diminish her. The murmurs swelled again, but Jacob remained, a steadfast presence, unmoved by gossip or judgment. He stepped closer, dust swirling at his boots like tiny storms, and tilted his hat back slightly, letting the light catch the edges of his face. A boy whispered, "Who's he?" And another muttered, "Don't see why he bothers." But their words barely grazed the thickening tension. Evelyn's breath came shallow, hot in her chest, and she shifted, adjusting the strap of her suitcase. The auctioneer's gavel struck again, louder this time, demanding attention, driving home the cruel auction of her worth. Hands reached toward her, prospective buyers, but her gaze locked on Jacob's steady frame, and a silent understanding passed between them. She was not alone. The town square seemed to contract and expand with the rhythm of her pulse. The dusty wind tangling her hair around her face. Sweat ran down her temple, blending with the grit that clung to her skin, and she closed her eyes for a heartbeat, imagining a life beyond judgment, Jacob's presence beside the boardwalk, steady and unwavering, was a tether to that imagined world. His shadow shifted as he moved to place a hand on the post, not touching her, yet offering an unspoken vow. "You will not face this alone." The auctioneer barked another call, and a hand hovered over the bid paddle, poised to claim her as if she were a commodity. Evelyn swallowed, forcing her fear down like a stubborn river dammed by willpower, and straightened her shoulders, feeling, for the first time, that her story need not end here. A soft wind stirred the loose straw beneath her boots, curling around her ankles like a promise of change. Jacob's voice, still quiet but firm, rose just above the distant clamor. "Not today. You're mine to protect." The words carried weight, an anchor in the torrent of ridicule. Heads turned, murmurs faltered, and a hush, almost imperceptible, spread through the crowd. The sun slanted low, glinting off the copper rooftops, illuminating the dust in golden streaks, and for a brief moment, Evelyn felt seen, not as too big or undesirable, but as someone worth defending. Her hands, still trembling, unclenched around her suitcase, a small act of surrender to a force gentler than fear, stronger than cruelty. She inhaled the hot Montana air, tasting freedom in the swirling dust, and dared a glance at the man who had carved a space of safety amidst the storm of judgment. The auctioneer's gavel fell once more, sharp and final, but Evelyn's gaze did not waver. Her heart beat with a quiet defiance, and the promise of rescue lingered in the amber light, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The wind whipped across the open plains, tugging at Evelyn's skirts and tangling her hair as she followed Jacob along the narrow trail leading out of Dry Creek. Dust clung to her boots, to the hem of her dress, and to the trembling tension in her shoulders. Each step a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Jacob rode beside her on a dark bay horse, its flanks slick with sweat, the animal's rhythmic snort and hoofbeats against the hard-packed earth, a grounding drumbeat against the chaos in her mind. The scent of leather, horse, and distant pine mingled in the air, a sharp contrast to the acrid fear she had carried all day. Her hands rested lightly on the reins Jacob had lent her, trembling, not from the cold, for the evening air held warmth, but from the uncertainty of trusting a man whose presence seemed so calm, so unwavering. Lanterns swung gently from the porch of his cabin as they arrived, casting a golden glow over the worn wood and hinting at refuge within. Jacob dismounted first, offering a hand that was steady, warm, and insistently reassuring. Evelyn hesitated, biting the inside of her cheek, unsure if anyone could truly be trusted, and yet the roughness of his palm and the sincerity in his eyes drew her forward, bridging a chasm she had long believed uncrossable. Inside, the cabin smelled of burning wood and something comforting she couldn't name. Stew, herbs, and the faint scent of leather and old timber. The fire flickered against the walls, shadows dancing as Jacob removed his hat and gestured toward a chair by the hearth. "Sit," he said simply, voice low, steady, a cadence that seemed to echo through her chest more than the words themselves. As she lowered herself into the chair, a blanket was draped over her shoulders before she could protest. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar smoke and reassurance. Jacob set down a steaming bowl of stew, its aroma rich with onions and root vegetables, and offered her a spoon. Their fingers brushed briefly, a spark of warmth and promise that went beyond the simple act. Evelyn hesitated, then accepted, tasting the thick broth, the flavor grounding her in a way words never could. For the first time in hours, perhaps days, she laughed quietly, a soft, incredulous sound that startled even herself. Jacob smiled, a faint curve of lips that carried more comfort than any speech. "Never thought I'd hear that laugh in Dry Creek," he murmured, and she shook her head, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Outside, the town murmurs continued, faint but persistent. Rumors traveled faster than the wind. Some whispered that Jacob had a foolish streak in protecting her. Others eyed her with suspicion, yet their voices were distant, muffled by the walls of the cabin and the crackling warmth of the fire. Evelyn's tension began to loosen, a subtle shift in her posture, as if the weight of judgment she carried had lifted just enough for her to breathe. Jacob spoke little, his presence filling the space in place of conversation, yet his small gestures, pouring her water, moving a chair closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, spoke volumes. Each action told her she was safe here, that the world outside did not have the power to define her within these walls. As the evening darkened into night, they shared stories between sips of tea and quiet laughter, revelations mingling with cautious joy. Jacob spoke of his ranch, the struggles with livestock and seasons, his voice carrying a depth that hinted at loneliness tempered with resilience. Evelyn responded with fragments of her past, careful not to reveal too much, yet finding that words could soothe in ways she hadn't known were possible. Outside, the wind howled over the plains, rustling the dry grass, but inside, firelight and the aroma of home wove a protective cocoon around them. Silence stretched comfortably between sentences, punctuated by small touches. A hand offered, a blanket adjusted. A glance held a moment longer than necessary, each one a declaration of connection, stronger than any spoken promise. The night wore on, lanterns swinging softly and firelight flickering across wooden walls, and Evelyn felt a strange but undeniable peace. For the first time since leaving her guardians, she allowed herself to imagine belonging, a place where safety and warmth could coexist with her independence. Jacob's gaze, quiet and steady, followed her, watching over her with unspoken care. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, tasting hope like the stew still warm on her tongue. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, wind carrying the distant whispers of Dry Creek. But inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to the warmth of the fire, the comfort of a shared meal, and the tentative promise of a new beginning. Rain lashed against the cabin windows with relentless fury, turning the prairie outside into a blur of mud and whistling wind. Thunder shook the walls, vibrating through the wooden floorboards, and Evelyn huddled closer to the fire, her knees pulled beneath her chin, eyes darting to the dancing shadows cast by the flames. Each flash of lightning illuminated the worry etched into her face, the way her hands twisted together as though she could wring courage from them. The storm outside mirrored the tempest inside her, a chaos of fear, self-doubt, and longing for a place to belong. She had spent her life being judged, pushed aside, and sold for the very body she had no control over. And yet, here, in this warm cabin, with Jacob sitting near the hearth, she felt the pull of something daring and unfamiliar, trust. Jacob's broad shoulders were bathed in firelight, the flickering orange casting his profile in dramatic relief. He did not speak at first, allowing the silence to stretch, heavy with unspoken understanding. "You don't have to hide from it," he murmured finally, voice low, steady, almost swallowed by the roar of the storm. His eyes held hers unwavering, offering solace without demanding words. Evelyn exhaled slowly, letting some of the tension leave her body, yet a shiver ran down her spine, not from cold, but from the intimacy of being truly seen. Memories surfaced unbidden, the laughter of children in her small, cramped home, quickly replaced by sneers and scornful whispers from the ones meant to protect her. She had learned early that vulnerability was dangerous, that the world would punish it. Now, the storm's wailing echoed her inner tumult, making the past and present collide in a way that left her raw, exposed and trembling. Jacob shifted closer, the scent of leather and pine wrapping around her like a shield. He spoke quietly of his own losses, stories of ranch hands lost to sickness, of cattle stolen by cruel neighbors, of nights spent alone with only wind and regret for company. Evelyn listened, the rhythm of his voice blending with the storm, each word a thread weaving them closer. Their shared confessions created a fragile bridge of understanding, a space where both pain and hope could coexist. She dared a tentative glance at his hand, resting near hers, the warmth of his presence seeping through the rough fabric of her sleeves. The fire flickered, and the shadows leapt across the walls, turning the cabin into a sanctuary from both the external tempest and the internal one that had long haunted her. Lightning struck the prairie beyond the cabin, illuminating the skeletal silhouettes of distant trees bent under the wind. Evelyn flinched, drawing her knees tighter, and Jacob's hand brushed hers lightly, a fleeting touch that carried more weight than the storm's roar. Her heart thudded, hesitant and wild, a quiet thrill igniting within her chest. She thought of the auction, the murmurs of Dry Creek, the long hours of solitude and judgment, and realized how far she had come to allow herself even this small closeness. The storm became a mirror of her courage, tumultuous, frightening, but impossible to ignore. Each rumble of thunder underscored her fears, yet the hand beside hers offered a grounding certainty that had always been absent. Outside, rain pelted the roof, filling the gaps between heartbeats with the cadence of nature's relentless force. Evelyn's thoughts wandered to the moments of tenderness Jacob had shown. A blanket offered without a word, the careful way he handed her a cup of tea, the patience in his eyes that demanded nothing but understanding. She realized that trust, fragile and tentative, could bloom even in the harshest weather, both literal and emotional. As the storm raged, their silence deepened, and the space between them charged with unspoken possibility. One finger brushed against another, tentative, testing boundaries, and a spark of something unnameable flickered between them. Thunder rolled again, louder, shaking the cabin with a violent insistence. But Evelyn no longer flinched as she had before. Instead, she let the warmth of the fire and the nearness of Jacob settle around her, filling her chest with a trembling, fragile hope. The storm, with all its chaos, had become a conduit for connection, a mirror of their vulnerabilities, and a stage for intimacy. As lightning illuminated his profile one last time before fading into darkness, Evelyn felt her heart tilt toward him, a hesitant pull as thrilling as it was terrifying. The room held its breath, the wind howled outside, and the night promised that, amidst the storms within and without, love's first tentative spark had begun to glow. The first rays of morning stretched across Dry Creek, gilding the rooftops with gold as the town began to stir. Whispers followed her like shadows, curling around corners, slipping through saloon doors, and curling under the boards of every porch. "Seen her with that Jacob feller again?" a woman muttered to her neighbor, clutching a basket of apples as she cast a wary glance toward the ranch at the edge of town. "Ain't right for a woman like her to be living out there with him," the neighbor added, eyes narrowed, voice thick with suspicion. Evelyn heard none of it directly, yet the weight of their judgment pressed on her shoulders like the noon sun, and she felt it in the way the wind carried their hushed tones across the prairie. Each whisper was a blade, but she had begun to steel herself, learning that strength could exist even under scrutiny. At the edge of the ranch, Lily tugged at Evelyn's skirts, her small fingers warm and insistent. "Tell me a story, Mama," the child murmured, eyes wide and trusting. Evelyn knelt beside her, brushing a strand of wind-tangled hair from her face. "A story about hope," she said softly, voice wrapping around the girl like a blanket. She spun tales of endless plains, of skies that held promise, of hearts that could heal even after pain. Lily's laughter chimed, fragile but bright, a contrast to the gnawing tension that simmered in town. In those moments, Evelyn felt a purpose she had never known: to teach resilience, to be a sanctuary in a world so quick to condemn. Her hands smoothed the girl's hair, lingering, imprinting love where abandonment had once resided. Meanwhile, Jacob worked steadily at the corral, mending the fence torn by last week's storm. Hammer and nails rang against wood, each strike deliberate, a rhythm that harmonized with the steady thrum of Evelyn's heart as she prepared the morning meal in the cabin. The fire crackled, warming the room, throwing long shadows that danced along the walls, a subtle reflection of the unease and possibility in their lives. Evelyn caught Jacob's glance as he paused to lift a plank, their eyes meeting for a heartbeat longer than reason allowed. Unspoken emotions shimmered between them in the quiet: admiration, longing, and the unsteady thrill of affection growing beyond mere protection. The kitchen smelled of sizzling bacon, fresh bread and the earthy aroma of coffee, the sensory richness grounding them amidst the unsteady currents of gossip beyond the ranch's boundaries. By mid-morning, the prairie air carried the distant sounds of town life: horse hooves on the dirt streets, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But the ranch existed in a different rhythm, one of work and shared silences. Jacob's presence offered security, and his occasional protective comments when townsfolk ventured too close reinforced that they were a unit, even if unofficial. When a neighbor shouted over the fence, "Best not be leading her astray, Jacob," he only tipped his hat, voice calm but firm. "She's safe here, and she's learning more than you know." The simplicity of his assertion, backed by quiet confidence, reminded Evelyn of the rare constancy she had longed for. As afternoon waned, Evelyn and Lily wandered near the creek, collecting wildflowers, laughing softly despite the echoes of suspicion trailing behind. Evelyn showed the child how to weave a small crown from blossoms, each loop a lesson in patience, resilience, and the small triumphs of life. Lily's fingers were clumsy but determined, and Evelyn's gentle corrections were laced with encouragement. Jacob watched from a distance, leaning on the fence, a silhouette against the amber light of the fading sun, feeling both pride and a stirring in his chest as he observed their bond. The ranch, bathed in firelight from the hearth as dusk approached, seemed to cocoon them from the harshness outside, a living emblem of warmth and belonging. Evening brought shadows that stretched long across the floorboards, flickering in tandem with the firelight as Evelyn served supper. She and Jacob exchanged glances across the table, brief and loaded, the unspoken understanding of shared burdens and tentative romance lingering between them. Outside, the wind whispered against the cabin, carrying fragments of town gossip, yet inside, the warmth of hearth, food, and mutual care created a barrier against intrusion. Lily's small voice broke the quiet, leaning close to Evelyn as she whispered a secret. "I want us to be a family. All of us together." The words hung in the air, binding them in a fragile, chosen unity. Evelyn's chest swelled with tenderness, and Jacob's hand brushed hers across the table, hesitant but electric, sealing the unspoken pact of their makeshift family as the firelight danced on their faces and the shadows of the night embraced them. The late afternoon sun gilded the endless plains as Evelyn and Jacob rode side by side, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against dry earth echoing across the golden fields. Dust rose in swirling clouds, coating their boots and clinging to hair damp with sweat, but neither noticed. The distant silhouette of a rider appeared on the horizon, a man with a wide-brimmed hat and the unmistakable air of entitlement. It was Barrett, the greedy land baron who had been circling the town for weeks, intent on claiming the ranch and anyone who dared stand in his way. Evelyn's stomach twisted with fear, but beneath it stirred a flicker of resolve, a recognition that running had never solved anything. She tightened her grip on the reins, meeting Jacob's storm-dark eyes, and found reassurance there, steady and unwavering. "Ready?" he asked, voice low, carrying the weight of trust. She nodded, determination threading through her fear. The chase was swift and brutal. Horses thundered across the plains, ears pinned back, muscles straining, hooves kicking up a golden haze. Barrett's shouts carried on the wind, but Jacob's steady presence beside her made the chaos bearable. Every twist of the trail, every gallop over uneven ground, forced Evelyn to confront not just the threat ahead, but the shadows within, the lingering insecurities that had followed her since childhood. She recalled the auction, the harsh judgment, the whispered cruelty that had haunted her every step. And yet, with Jacob's hand brushing against hers for guidance, offering both reassurance and connection, she felt the first real sense of worth. Measured not by others, but by the strength she carried inside. They reached the edge of the creek, where Barrett had intended to block their path. Jacob reined in, positioning his horse with careful precision, and Evelyn mirrored his movements. Tension crackled between them and the land baron, whose smug confidence faltered as he realized they acted in unison. Words were exchanged, sharp, biting, tempered by the raw tension of confrontation. But neither Evelyn nor Jacob wavered. Their shared glances, the subtle shift of a shoulder or tilt of a head, communicated volumes, a silent choreography honed through trust. Barrett's final threat hung in the air, but the pair's solidarity proved more formidable than any words. By evening, the threat had been temporarily thwarted and the ranch lay quiet under a sky streaked with violet and amber. They dismounted near the fire pit, the smell of burning wood mingling with sweat and the earthiness of the horses. Evelyn's chest heaved, not from exertion alone, but from the surge of adrenaline and the comforting realization that she was not alone. Jacob tended to the horses with methodical care, his presence reassuring, protective, a constant reminder that love need not be loud to be enduring. She watched him, admiring the steady strength in his hands, the focus in his eyes, and the rare, gentle smile that flickered across his lips when he caught hers lingering in the firelight. Night descended, and they sat together around the campfire, the flames crackling and sending shadows leaping across their faces. Evelyn shared fragments of fear and doubt she had never voiced aloud, the murmured confessions mingling with the pop and hiss of the fire. Jacob listened, offering comfort in the smallest of ways. A hand resting lightly on hers, a reassuring nod, a glance that carried more promise than any grand declaration. She allowed herself to laugh softly, a sound that felt like wind over the prairie, carrying away remnants of anxiety and shame. The warmth of their shared presence became a fortress against the harshness of the world, the silence between words as eloquent as speech. As embers glowed and the night deepened, Evelyn reflected on the day's trials. She realized that her value was not dictated by town gossip, harsh judgment, or the expectations of those who could not see her worth. She had faced danger and fear, side by side with someone who accepted her fully, and discovered that love and courage could coexist in the same heart. Jacob's steady support, his protective but gentle demeanor, underscored a truth she had long denied herself. Trust could blossom into something enduring, even amidst chaos. A soft wind rustled the dry grass, carrying the distant calls of coyotes, and Evelyn leaned slightly toward Jacob. Their fingers brushed once more, a lingering touch that spoke of promise, comfort, and a bond forged not by circumstance but by choice. The fire flickered, shadows danced, and for a moment, the world beyond the ranch ceased to exist, leaving only warmth, laughter, and the quiet assurance that they could face any trial together. The first light of dawn stretched across the prairie, spilling gold and rose over the rolling hills, painting Dry Creek in a warmth that felt almost like redemption. Dust lingered in the air, settling slowly after the storms that had battered both the land and Evelyn's spirit. She stepped onto the boardwalk outside the cabin, the rough wood firm beneath her boots, and took a slow, deep breath of the crisp morning air. For the first time in years, she felt unburdened, the weight of rejection and judgment slipping from her shoulders like the morning mist lifting from the fields. Jacob stood beside her, hands intertwined, his grip steady and comforting. His gaze held hers, storm-dark eyes softened by the quiet pride he carried for her resilience. The town was beginning to stir, neighbors peeking from behind curtains, whispers no longer sharp with judgment, but tinged with curiosity and tentative respect. Barrett's schemes had failed, and the community had begun to recognize the strength and worth that Evelyn had always possessed. She noticed the subtle nods of acknowledgement, the cautious smiles as people who had once cast stones now seemed willing to see her fully. Jacob's hand tightened around hers, not forcefully, but with a reassurance that said without words, "You belong here. You've earned this life." Evelyn's chest rose and fell with measured calm, the fear that had clung for so long dissolving with each heartbeat. From behind, a small voice called her name. Lily ran into her arms, the child's face flushed with excitement and trust. "Mama," she whispered, eyes bright and unwavering. Evelyn's breath caught, tears threatening, as she held the girl tightly. The word, so simple yet so profound, solidified the family they had become, a family chosen, stitched together by love and courage rather than obligation. Jacob knelt beside them, one arm draped around Evelyn's shoulders, the other resting on Lily's small back, and the three of them formed a tableau of belonging that neither distance nor gossip nor past cruelty could undo. The prairie beyond shimmered under the early sun, golden grass swaying gently, wildflowers nodding as if in approval. Birds called to one another across the horizon, their songs harmonizing with the quiet rustle of the wind. The ranch, once a place of toil and guarded safety, now felt expansive, alive with possibility. Jacob and Evelyn walked slowly along the fence line, hands still entwined, exchanging quiet words punctuated by soft laughter and lingering glances. Every touch, every glance, was a silent affirmation of trust, passion, and the tenderness that had grown steadily in the spaces between their shared trials. Inside the cabin, the hearth glowed softly, embers mirroring the warmth that now radiated from their hearts. Evelyn moved with ease, preparing a simple breakfast, the smell of fresh bread and coffee mingling with the earthy scent of the ranch. Jacob assisted without comment, stacking firewood and tending to small chores, his presence a calm anchor in the domestic rhythm. The intimacy of routine, the shared silences and glances, spoke volumes. Love was not always grand declarations or fiery passion. It was steadiness, care, and the courage to be seen fully. Evelyn paused on the porch, watching the sun rise higher, bathing the prairie in brilliant light. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the auction, the whispers, the cruel judgments that had once defined her. Each memory had shaped her, yes, but it no longer controlled her. With Jacob by her side and Lily's small hand slipping into hers, she realized that rejection could be countered by love, and pain could be healed with tenderness and patience. The town's acceptance, while gradual, reflected the transformation not just of the community, but of her own perception of self-worth. As they stood together, the wind brushing softly against their faces, Evelyn felt a profound sense of completion. The world was vast and unpredictable, yet in this moment, with hands entwined, hearts open, and laughter mingling with morning birdsong, she embraced her second life fully. No longer defined by others' cruelty, she was free, loved, and whole. The prairie stretched endlessly, promising tomorrow and every day after that, a canvas for the life she would live on her own terms. And in that golden dawn, surrounded by the people she loved and who loved her in return, Evelyn understood. Love could rewrite a life once marred by rejection, painting it with warmth, hope, and enduring joy.